Hello and welcome to my comprehensive tier list ranking of every single item in Risk of Rain 2. I know this is a random sort of video for my channel, but I've been playing quite a bit of Risk of Rain 2 lately, especially since the Artifacts 2.0 update. I decided to put this together because a lot of my friends have recently been getting into the game, and the player base as a whole has had a decent surge lately. So I figured this would be a good resource for newer players to gauge the overall effectiveness of any given item, as getting items is the core aspect of Risk of Rain 2's gameplay, or any roguelikes for that matter. Obviously, some items will be better on certain survivors than others, and I'll explain those when we cover those items, but each item will still only be getting one overall ranking. One last thing, to briefly explain what each tier means, the F tier is reserved for items that literally only make your life harder. There is no situation in which these items, or just item, as you'll see later, will ever benefit you directly. E tier is for items that still have a use and can still benefit you in some situations, but overall are more likely to hinder you in some way than anything else. D tier is for items that won't necessarily hinder you, but still are very lackluster. C tier is for items that are helpful, but are either too situational or don't scale very well. B tier is for items that aren't going to be super powerful, but are still solid enough. A tier is for items that are either still somewhat situational, or just aren't as impactful as some S tier items, but are still very helpful. And finally, the S tier is reserved for those items that are amazing in basically every situation you can think of. These are the items you'll want to stock up on the most. Side note, this tier list is based around monsoon difficulty with no artifacts enabled. Some artifacts can and will dictate which items you'll want to prioritize given how game-changing some of the artifacts are, but I won't be addressing those here, maybe in another video in the future. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's get into it. First up, we'll be covering the common items. These are the wide items you'll be coming across the most, as you would probably expect, given the whole common thing. These items generally don't have any massive flashy effects and are mostly just passive buffs to your character, but don't take that to mean they're not worthwhile. Many of them are still very helpful, as we'll see once we get into it. First up, we have the armor piercing rounds, which are a solid B tier. Now when they say 20% more damage to boss enemies, it actually means the enemies that specifically have a red health bar. Generally that just means the teleporter boss enemies, which yes, does actually include the horde of mini fights that the teleporter summons occasionally, but also includes the Alloy Worship unit on Siren's Call, Aurelionite, and the Twisted Scavengers. This does not include World Spawn boss enemies that are just hanging out outside of the teleporter event once you get later on in a run. So even though it's a decent damage buff, it's going to sit nicely in the B tier. Next we have the backup magazine, which is an A. Having a second charge of your secondary is very nice, especially on survivors like the Huntress and the Artificer. However, it's also not very useful on characters like Rex or the Engineer. Also, on most characters, the later your run goes, the less damage will be coming from your abilities, and more will be coming from just your items. Also, to get the multiple charges of your secondary, you still have to wait the full cooldown for them to charge back up individually. So once you use them all against a boss, you're basically back down to only having one charge. Now I know it sounds like I'm ragging on the backup mags quite a bit, but they're still really helpful early to mid-game. It's just the lack of consistent use across all the survivors, as well as their helpfulness in the late game falling off a little bit that sits them in the A tier. But don't worry, they're still really nice to get. Next we have the bundle of fireworks that get a B. Yes, they can do some decent damage, especially once you get a few stacks of them going, but what's holding them back is their inability to proc your other items, their lack of consistent use, i.e. having to interact with something, and your lack of control of them. They're really just some extra random damage that you'll deal to some random enemy halfway across the map. Next up we have the bustling fungus, which gets a C. Remember when I said certain items are more effective on certain survivors than others? Yeah, the fungus is the prime example of that. This item is an absolute godsend on the Engineer, because your turrets inherit your items, and your turrets never move unless you're using the walking turrets, which, please don't. However, on literally every other survivor, the fungus requires you to stop moving entirely for 2 seconds before you get any healing. And, unless you have a lot of stacks of it, the healing is fairly lackluster, especially if you desperately need a heal. The fungus is nice early game because you'll have breaks between enemy spawns more frequently to pause and heal up if you really need to, but once you get to mid to late game, if you stand still for that long, there's a good chance something will be able to just walk up and smack you since you aren't moving around. And even if you do have enough stacks of it to make the healing worthwhile, you probably have plenty of other more reliable sources of healing at that point. Overall, they just ask too much of you for not enough benefit. There are much better sources of healing we'll cover later. Unless you're playing Engineer though, like I said, godsend. Next we have the Cautious Slug, which gets an A. Hey, look at that, a better source of healing. The slug pops up when you haven't taken any damage for 5 seconds. But wait, doesn't it say while outside of combat? Well, the only thing that cancels the slug is you taking damage. You can be actively shooting, using abilities, moving, and jumping around and still receive the increased regen from the slug, so long as you aren't getting hit. Once you get better at dodging, or you have a lot of items that make it harder for enemies to hit you, you'll have this thing up a lot. The healing you get from it isn't super crazy or anything, but it's a very nice addition. Next we have the Crowbar, which gets a B. The Crowbar is a very good item on characters like the Loader and the Artificer, or with items like the Royal Capacitor that rely on heavy burst damage rather than sustained DPS. However, on other characters, the Crowbar at best gives you a decent bit of extra DPS against monsters until they fall below 90% of their HP, and then it goes back to doing nothing. It has very low impact on sustained DPS from multiple sources. However, it's still a free damage buff and it's very good on burst builds, so it gets a B. Next we have the Energy Drink that gets an A. The best ways to stay alive in this game, if you can't just outright kill everything before it kills you, are to either have a high amount of reliable healing, or be mobile enough to just not get hit. The Energy Drink gives you a good chunk of extra mobility. However, if you aren't still trying to dish out damage, you're really just delaying the inevitable. A lot of characters aren't able to keep attacking or using abilities while sprinting, so it gets an A for being a little situational. Next we have the Focus Crystal, which gets a C. It's a good damage increase on the Mercenary and the Loader, but it's basically only on them. Sure, sometimes you'll be up in things' faces as the Commando or Acrid, but most of the time you'll be outside of the tiny radius required to receive the benefit from it, or you'll just get mowed down very quickly by that overloading LD Lemurian. Overall, it's helpful, but it's too situational. Next, the Fresh Meat, and it gets a B. It's a nice free health regen increase when you kill things, but sometimes, like when you're fighting a boss, you won't be killing stuff all the time to receive the benefit from it. It also doesn't actually increase the healing per second you get the more stacks you have, it only increases the duration of the buff, so it falls off pretty hard the later your run gets. The buff also doesn't stack. If you get another kill while the buff is still active, it just refreshes the timer instead of giving you additional regen. It's still a solid and consistent source of healing in the early to mid game though, so it gets a B. Next we have the Gasoline, which gets a C. Unfortunately, even after the buff it received in Artifacts 2.0, it's still just not very good past the first couple of stages. It's a nice source of AoE damage early on for characters like the Commando who struggle with crowds, but it falls off really quickly. It's also significantly outclassed by another item that we'll talk about later that basically just does the same thing but much better. Next we have the Lensmaker's Glasses, which are our first S tier item. The lenses are the best common item in my opinion. Think of it this way, critical hits in this game deal 100% more damage, and each stack of the lenses gives you 10% chance to crit. So each stack, until you reach 100% crit chance, effectively gives you 10% more overall damage. This applies to your primary attacks, all your abilities, and all of your items that deal total damage. So 10% more damage to basically everything, excluding things like Gasoline and things that deal damage over time, such as Acrid's Poison. Which is most things. Lenses are extremely impactful items, and I always go out of my way to get 9 of them in every single run. I know 9 only adds up to 90% crit chance, but I'll explain that later. Next we have the Medkit, which gets a D. Before Artifacts 2.0, I probably would have given the Medkit a C, maybe even a B, but the change to it hurt it pretty badly. They increased the healing you get from it, however, they also increased the time you have to wait before it goes off. You have to wait 3 whole seconds to get a single burst of healing, which isn't even that much I might add. And if you take any source of damage during that 3 seconds, the timer resets to 0 and you still only get the 1 heal. Sure, the burst of healing can get pretty high with just a couple stacks, but other items such as the Slug can heal just as much if not more, much more consistently. Overall, it's just severely outperformed by most other healing items. Speaking of healing items, we have the Monster Tooth Necklace, which also gets a D. It's the only other healing item on par with the Medkit. First off, you have to kill an enemy to get the healing, You have to manually collect the orb, which has a tiny collection radius, and the healing is pretty lackluster. The fresh meat basically has the same effect of healing you on kill, but entirely for free. It's just not very good. Next we have Paul's Goat Hoof, which is an S. Thank God I get to talk about a good item after those two. Now I know what you're thinking, didn't the energy drink only get an A? It's a 30% buff, the Goat Hoof is only 14%, which, yes, that's true. However, the Goat Hoof's 14% movement speed buff is always active no matter what you're doing. You don't need to be sprinting to get the benefit, which for a lot of characters is an extremely helpful addition. Other than that, it's good for the same reason the energy drink is. Being more mobile allows you to traverse the map and complete stages faster, as well as increasing your dodging capability. The only difference between the two is the Goat Hoof isn't situational. Next we go from the S tier, all the way down to the worst common item, the personal shield generator, sitting all the way down at E tier. Now yes, having additional health is normally a good thing. However, shields function differently from your normal health. The biggest thing about shields is that you can't regenerate them rapidly with items like you can your base health. You have to wait 7 seconds without taking any damage for them to start recharging, and it takes another 2 seconds for them to fully recharge. If you take any damage during those 9 seconds, including fall damage or self-damage from wrecks, the timer goes all the way back down to 0. The other biggest downside is that shields mess with your one-shot protection. Essentially, in this game, if you're above 90% of your max HP, you cannot be killed in a single hit. This mechanic is extremely important later in a run, as monsters will begin to do massive amounts of damage. If you have just 2 shield generators, they make up for 16% of your overall HP, and that ruins your one-shot protection. That is a major downside, therefore E tier. Can still be helpful at times, but is much more likely to hurt you than it is to help you. Next we go to the Repulsion Armor Plate, which is a solid B. This is a new item to the Artifacts 2.0 update, and it's actually pretty solid, especially early on. Having a flat damage reduction is a very helpful benefit, especially early in a run where you'll only really be taking little pot shots, never really any big instances of damage, barring like the occasional stone golem. Later in the run though, once enemies start to deal larger amounts of damage, you'll start to feel the benefit of the armor plate less. It's pretty helpful early on, but there's a better defensive item for the late game that we'll get to shortly. Next up we have the Rusted Key, which also gets a B. At worst, the key does nothing for you. At best, it's a free item every stage. And once you get more and more stacks, the more likely that item will be of a higher quality. It takes just 5 keys for you to have at least a 10% chance of getting a legendary from the lockbox, and just 6 to have at least a 50% chance of getting an uncommon. The only downside is that unless you're actively looking for it, there's a high chance you won't just stumble across the lockbox, and even if you are looking for it, it can still be difficult to find at times. Overall though, solid item. Next we have the Soldier's Syringe, which gets an A. I know this might seem like it should be an S, but let me explain. While the 15% increase is nice, it only really affects your primary attack. It does increase the charge speed of abilities like the Artificer's secondary, but it's not as big of a damage buff as you'd think. Take the lenses like we discussed earlier, they're a 10% increase to all of your abilities and all of your items. There's also just better ways of increasing your attack speed, which we'll discuss later. Overall though, always a nice item to get. Next up we have these Sticky Bombs, which get a B. They're a nice little bit of additional damage, but that's about it. There are other items that we'll get to later that basically do the same thing, but are much more impactful. Sticky Bombs also have a hard cap at 20 stacks, since their damage doesn't increase with each stack, just the proc chance. That combined with the fact that they can't proc your other items like a lot of others can, and they're just outclassed. Still a nice damage increase though. Next we have the Stun Grenade, which gets a C. While the stun is always nice to have, it'll very rarely actually save you against a monster. Combine that with the fact that you can't stun boss monsters, many survivors have ways to stun or stagger implemented into their base kit, and the fact that the further you go, the fewer enemies you'll encounter that can be stunned, and overall the item just doesn't have too much impact. It's good enough though. Next we have the Topaz Brooch, which gets an A. Upon killing a monster, you receive something called Barrier, which is an increase to your max health. However, unlike shields, the barrier is counted entirely separately, so it doesn't interfere with your one-shot protection. Your barrier can go up to 100% of your max HP, which does include shields. However, the barrier you get is fairly minimal and will deplete fast, so you need a couple of stacks to really feel the effect of the barrier. As long as you can keep it up though, it's very helpful. Next we have the Tougher Times, which is an S. The teddy bears are that other defensive item I mentioned earlier. These would probably be the best common item if not for the lenses. The bears are the only way in the game to just outright ignore damage entirely. They're essentially just a safety net for when you do get hit, but they're extremely reliable and the effect is undeniably helpful. The only thing about the item is that the entry in the logbook is actually a little misleading. Instead of being a 15% chance per stack, it actually starts at a 13% chance and it increases hyperbolically. I'll put up a graph of how it works now so you can visualize it. Basically, the more stacks you have, the less the chance will increase with each stack, and you'll never truly reach a 100% chance. As you can see, you can get very close, but even with 10,000 stacks, you aren't truly invincible. Next up we have the Tri-Tip Dagger, which gets a C. Tri-Tips deal a decent amount of damage early on, but like the Gasoline, they deal base damage, not total damage, so they scale very poorly. Past the first loop or so, their damage really starts to fall off. However, since they're pretty good early on, and they have synergy with another item we'll cover later, they get a C. And finally, rounding out the common items, we have the War Banner, which unfortunately also gets a C. While the attack speed and movement speed buff is good, the radius is very limited early on. Once you get enough stacks of it for the radius to be large enough to not be limiting, leveling up becomes more and more infrequent, so it comes into play less often. However, the buff is nice enough to have in a lot of situations, so it gets a C. Now we're moving on to the uncommon items. These are the green items you'll come across. Generally, these are going to be more powerful than the commons, so we'll be seeing a lot more A's and S's. Starting off the uncommons with the heavy hitter, we have the ATG Missile Launcher, which is an S. The ATG is what I would probably consider to be the most powerful uncommon item. The ATG has a chance to fire off any hit with the proc coefficient and deals 300% total damage. So if you have a 1.0 proc coefficient, it's a 10% chance for 300% damage, which is an effectively 30% damage increase. Since the ATG scales off the damage of the hit that procs it, if you combine it with some high damage burst options like a capacitor, Prion accumulator, or certain survivors, it'll dish out a ton of damage. All that, combined with the fact that it has a 1.0 proc coefficient, and they'll scale off of that damage, and hoo boy, this thing carries its weight. Next we have the Bandolier, which is a C tier. While the cooldown resets are nice, since you have to walk over them to get the effect, as well as them not always dropping, they're pretty situational. It's also not very obvious if you pick one up in the middle of the chaos of a teleporter event, for example, so it could use a more noticeable tell. Also, as I mentioned with the backup mags, your cooldowns will eventually become less important than the rest of your items. The best thing about the Bandolier though is that the pickup range for the ammo boxes is much more generous than the Monster Tooth Necklace orbs. Next up we have the Berserker's Pauldron, which is an A. Now, if you get a Pauldron early on, you'll very rarely get the effect. However, the later your run goes, the more likely you'll be to get the buff, and the buff is very potent. A 50% movement speed increase and a 100% attack speed increase is nothing to sneeze at. For 6 seconds nonetheless, and even more than that if you get more stacks. The only reason it's not an S tier is that it can be pretty hard to get the buff until you get later in a run. Next we have the infamous Chrono Bauble, which is a C. Prior to Artifacts 2.0, this thing probably would have been in the D tier, competing for the title of the worst uncommon. The slow on hit this thing provides has extremely low impact on your run, and the more stacks you get doesn't even increase how potent the slow is, just the duration. However, since that debuff applies on all hits, this thing actually synergizes very well with a new item that was added in Artifacts 2.0, which we'll cover next actually, so it gets a C. The next item is the Death Mark, which gets an A. I really want to give this thing an S. A 50% damage increase per stack to enemies is insane. However, because it's so reliant on other items, I have to give it an A. To get 4 debuffs on an enemy, you kind of have to go a little out of your way to get all the items you need, but it's well worth the effort. The Tri-Tip Dagger and the Chrono Bauble both apply debuffs, which are those synergies I mentioned earlier. Acrid, Rex, the Artificer, and 2 other items we'll cover later also provide pretty consistent debuffs to proc the Death Mark. Like I said, it can be hard to get up, but it's extremely powerful once you have consistent debuffs going. Also, if you didn't know, Death Mark is currently bugged as of this recording. Currently, it does not stack. so getting more than one stack of Deathmark is pointless right now, which is a shame because it'd be very powerful if it was working properly. Next up we have the Fuel Cell, which gets an A. Most equipments in this game are very powerful and many have the potential to make or break a fight. The Fuel Cell not only reduces the cooldown of your equipment, but on top of that it gives you an additional charge of it as well. Now it sounds like the Fuel Cell should be an S tier, but it's only really as powerful as the equipment you're carrying. So if you're carrying, say, a capacitor or a tonic or a preon, it's extremely helpful. But if you're carrying a foreign fruit or a blast shower or a crowdfunder, it's not very helpful, so it gets an A. Next there's the Gore's Tome, which also gets an A. Getting one of these early on can really speed up your run, especially in those first few stages where it feels like it takes ages for monsters to spawn. Especially with a couple extra stacks, it can really start to snowball and get you much further ahead than you would be normally. Although its use starts to fall off once you get to stage 9 or so, because it's so potent in speeding up the early game and your early game is a massive determining factor in how good your run is, it gets an A. And next up we have the Harvester's Scythe, which gets an S. The leech you get on crit is some of the most consistent healing in the game. Yes, it relies on having decent crit chance to get the full effect, but realistically you should be getting that anyways. The Scythe also has a hidden effect of giving you 5% crit chance on the first stack, so it doesn't completely rely on lenses for you to get the effect. Leeching on crit is an incredibly valuable effect, and you get a solid amount of healing per crit as well. For reference, with one Scythe you get the same health per crit automatically as you would get from a Monster Tooth necklace on kill that you need to go out of your way to pick up. Scythes are probably the most powerful method of healing. Next we have the Hopu Feather, which is an A. Remember when I said mobility is one of the most important elements of staying alive? Yeah, having an extra jump or two can make you near impossible for certain enemies to hit. It also lets certain characters traverse the maps much easier, whether that's getting to areas previously inaccessible or being able to take shortcuts. Feathers are very helpful. Next we have the Infusion, which gets a B. Did you hear my explanation of why using shield generators could easily backfire but still wanted a way to increase your max health? Then this item is for you, especially after the Artifacts 2.0 update, which makes you build up your health even faster with more stacks. Infusion's a pretty solid item overall. The max health increase is still not quite as impactful as you might hope, however. Also, as I'll explain later, having less health can actually prove to be more beneficial in certain situations, so it gets a B. Next we have Chiaro's Band, which gets an S. This thing is a very solid item, dishing out a lot of damage. Kinda like the ATG, think of it as an 8% chance to 500% total damage, which is an effective 40% damage increase, which is actually more than the ATG comes out to. So why did I say the ATG is the best uncommon and not this? Because, unlike the ATG, Chiaro's Band lacks a proc coefficient, so it can't start to snowball with your other items. It also doesn't stack as well as the ATG does, as they both come out to a 60% increase overall at 2 stacks, with the ATG surpassing it with any more than that. Despite that, it's still an extremely powerful item. Next up there's the Leeching Seed, which gets a solid B. It has the same core effect as the Scythe of healing on hit. The only difference is the Leeching Seed doesn't require critical hits, but it heals much less. For reference, the Scythe heals 8 plus 4 per stack per crit, while the Leeching Seed only heals 1 per hit per stack, so it starts out as a lower heal and doesn't stack as well. While it's better statistically before you get some crit chance going, it gets surpassed very rapidly. Next we have the Lepton Daisy, which gets a C. A 50% burst of healing sounds nice, but it only happens once per stack during the teleporter event, so it only occurs in a limited area and at times you can't control. Combine that with the more consistent forms of healing and this thing just isn't that good. It's definitely not terrible though. Next we have the Old Guillotine, which is another S tier item. Personally, I would say this is the next best uncommon compared to the ATG. This effectively lowers the health pool of every elite monster you come across by a substantial amount. And the further your run goes, the more and more enemies will be elites, including some boss monsters. Like the teddy bears from earlier, this also doesn't scale quite like the logbook implies because it's also hyperbolic. But having just 5 guillotines effectively halves the HP of every elite monster you fight. This is massive when you consider that Blazing, Glacial, and Overloading elites have 4.7 times the health of normal monsters. and Malachite and Celestine elites have a whopping 23.5 times the health. Guillotines are very strong. Next, there's the Old War Stealth Kit, which gets an A. When I first started playing this game, I severely underestimated the usefulness of this thing. The movement speed buff alone is super helpful, but having all monsters drop aggro entirely can be a massive tide turner in certain fights. The biggest drawback is that if you get hit by something that applies a DOT, you'll still take damage from that. It also may just not proc before you get shotgunned by an elderly Murrian, so it doesn't make you invincible. Next, we have the Predatory Instincts, which is another S tier item. This is the best way of stacking attack speed in my opinion. You crit something, you attack faster, and are therefore more likely to crit again sooner, which causes you to attack even faster, and so on. The more stacks you have, the more attack speed buffs you can stack. This, like the Harvester's Scythe, also has a hidden 5% crit chance on the first stack. These two items are why I said I only go for 9 lenses instead of 10 usually. 9 lenses plus a Predatory and a Scythe brings you to full crit chance, not to mention the very obvious synergy all three items have together. It's a very powerful combination of items. Next, there's the Razor Wire, which gets an A. While the damage this thing puts out doesn't scale too well past the first loop, the biggest effect it has is being able to proc your other items in a pretty big area around you. The more stacks you have, the more enemies you can hit in a larger radius. Even the smallest amount of chip damage you take has the potential to wipe the immediate area when combined with your other items. And even without items, even though the damage doesn't scale super well, it's still nothing to scoff at. Get a Razor Wire or two and let a Magma Worm ignite you and watch its health bar melt. Next we have arguably the worst uncommon, the Red Whip, which sits in D tier. I'll give it this, if you're rushing the teleporter on each stage and then going for items, it's actually a pretty good speed bonus for doing that. But I wouldn't even recommend doing that until you're past the third loop or so. Now, you're probably thinking, wait, isn't this the same effect as the Slug, but with speed? Well, you might think. The only problem is, instead of being cancelled by damage like the Slug is, attacking or using skills of any sort cancels the effect, unless they're purely movement-based skills. So it's entirely useless until you haven't been fighting anything for at least 5 seconds. Guess what you'll be doing the vast majority of the time in this game? Fighting. I don't know if I need to explain any further why this item is as bad as it is. Next we have the Rose Buckler, which is a B. Like the energy drink, the buckler is mostly held back by needing to sprint to get the effect. However, it's a pretty potent item when applicable. The damage reduction from armor is calculated hyperbolically, but just one buckler gives you a 23% damage reduction while sprinting. And if you get up to 10, that brings it up to about 75. While it's not always usable, it's definitely very helpful when you can use it. Next we have Runald's Band, which sits in A tier. While it's not quite as good as its fiery counterpart, Runald's Band is still a very powerful on-hit item. The Ice Blast that hits enemies also applies a slow, which is actually a separate debuff from the Chronobauble slow, making Runald's Band synergize very well with the Deathmark. Fun fact, if you have both Chiaro's Band and Runald's Band, they will actually always proc together. This doesn't actually increase the chance of them proccing, however, as instead of having two separate 8% chances, they share just one 8% chance. So if you have both bands and enough debuffs to proc the Deathmark, the Fire Tornado from Chiara's band will start dealing a ton of damage when it procs. Next we have the newly added Squid Polyp, which gets a D. I really want to like the good Squid boys, but they're really not that good past the first loop, and even then, they can still deal some decent damage with 2 or 3 stacks early on, but they just don't add much overall due to how limited they are. They only spawn on interacting with something similarly to the fireworks, and rather than having a hard 30-second timer like the logbook implies, their health instead drains at a rate that kills them after 30 seconds. So, if you can heal them faster than their health drains, they'll actually stick around, but that also means if they get attacked, they'll go away faster. And monsters seem to love to attack these things. Honestly, they're just outperformed by the fireworks. I would say this is a contender for the worst uncommon with the Red Whip. Next, we have the fan favorite Ukulele, which gets an S. While it does good AoE damage early on, like many items, the biggest strength of the Ukulele is being able to proc your other items at a pretty high rate due to the amount of enemies it can hit. Especially with more stacks, it can hit more and more enemies, which can start some pretty ridiculous proc chains. and even though the damage itself isn't amazing, it's still very useful. Next we have the Warhorn, which gets an A. A 70% attack speed buff for 8 seconds is quite the buff, especially combined with some equipments that have shorter cooldowns. With only a couple Warhorns, you can practically have full uptime on it. The only thing holding it back is that it's only as good as your equipment's cooldown is short, and attack speed isn't as good as most would expect, as I've explained earlier. Next up there's the Wax Quail, which is also an A tier. That burst of speed on jumping is better for both dodging and traversing the map than you might expect. The only real drawback is past like 3, maybe 4 stacks. Personally, it feels more like a detriment or an annoyance than anything else. But more importantly, you have to be sprinting, which I've explained why is a limiting factor at times. And finally, rounding out the uncommons, we have the Will-o'-the-Wisp, which gets an S. This is the literally just gasoline but better item I referred to earlier. When you kill an enemy, the Wisp triggers an explosion that deals a lot of damage in a pretty good area. And if that kills any enemies, those enemies also trigger an explosion. If you've got a large group of enemies, you can get a crazy explosion chain going. This and the ukulele are some of the most reliable crowd controlling items in the game, and are a very valuable asset on any run. Also, the Wisp explosion can proc your other items. Go figure. Next up, we'll be saving the legendary items for last, so we'll briefly cover the boss items now. These are the items you can get sometimes from defeating a specific teleporter boss, with a couple exceptions that I'll explain when we get to them. I'm also not going to include the artifact key because, I mean, how would you really rank that? It's only used for the artifact reliquary fight, so I'll just be excluding that. First we have the Genesis Loop, which you can get from a Wandering Vagrant boss. This thing gets a solid B. This basically gives you the massive explosion the Vagrants have when they get low on HP. Essentially, once you fall below 25% HP, the item triggers and starts charging the explosion, and it deals a whopping 6,000% damage in a massive area around you. It's basically just a panic screen wipe for when you get low on health. So why is it in B tier? For one, it has a 30-second cooldown before you can use it again. And more importantly, you won't be getting to that low on health very often, and if you do, there's a very good chance you might just die in the 6 seconds it takes to charge the explosion. Basically, it's just not very consistently useful. Next we have the Halcyon Seed, which you get from defeating Aurelia Knight by activating a gold shrine and going through the subsequent gold portal. This thing is unfortunately only a C tier. As cool as it is to summon Aurelia Knight during the teleporter event, the friendly AI in this game isn't the brightest, which we'll see more of later, and he mostly just becomes a giant target. A lot of the time he'll focus his laser beam on the couple beetles running around way over there rather than the overloading Clay Dune Strider mowing you down right next to him. If he did some more damage and had smarter AI, he'd definitely be higher, but for now unfortunately it's only a C tier. Next up we have the Irradiant Pearl. Now this and the regular pearl we'll cover in just a minute you get from depositing any lunar item in a cleansing pool. Generally, cleansing pools are rather rare, and you won't really want to give up any lunars you have, because you have to go out of your way to get any of them. If you do go for them though, the Irradiant Pearl actually gets an A. It's very inconvenient to get, but in the instance that you do have one, having a 10% increase to all of your stats is pretty noteworthy buff. It's also one of the few ways in the game to just outright increase your raw damage stat. Next we have the Little Disciple, which you get from the Grove Tender. This gets an A and is probably the best boss item, I would say. It's restricted by the requirement to sprint, but the biggest strength is, say it with me, it can proc your other items. Firing a homing wisp every half second with a 1.0 proc coefficient is actually very strong, especially on those characters that can sprint while attacking like the Mercenary. It's basically just free extra item procs. Next there's the regular Pearl. This thing gets a C. There's not much to tell here. The extra health is nice, but it's not going to have nearly as much of an impact as you might think. Plus, as I mentioned with Infusion, sometimes having less health is actually better, which I'll explain once we get to the lunar items. Next we have the Queen's Gland, which you get from Beetle Queens. This thing gets a D and is definitely the worst boss item. Take every problem I explained with Aurelia Knight, but now instead of a badass powerful Golden Stone Titan, it's a Beetle Guard. Yeah, that's it, that's the item. Finally, we have the Titanic Knurl, which you get from Stone Titans. The Knurl gets a B. The extra health and regen are very nice to have, especially in the early to mid game. The health regen is what I would say is the most useful element of the knurl, as there are very few ways to just increase your passive regen. Because of that, I would say the knurl is one of the best items for increasing your max health. Now we'll be looking at the lunar items. These are the blue items you'll see in lunar pods or the bazaar that require you to spend lunar coins to get. Many of these have very powerful effects with some sort of catch. I'll explain the pros and cons to each one, and why some are better than others, and why some of the downsides might not be as big of downsides as you'd think. First we have the Beads of Fealty, which these are kind of different from the rest of the lunar items. Instead of actually giving you some sort of benefit during your actual run, they instead bring you to a secret boss fight if you have them when you obliterate at the obelisk in the Celestial Portal. If you can beat the boss, you'll obliterate like normal afterwards, but you'll get 10 extra lunar coins as a reward from the bag it drops. So at worst, it's a waste of a lunar coin, but at best it's an extra 9. I'm not really sure how to rank this, but since it's a good enough benefit, I'll just put it in the B tier. One important note though, stacking more than one of these literally does nothing, so don't waste your coins on it. Next we have the Brittle Crown, which is going to get a D. Now the extra money can be nice, however literally any damage you take will cause you to lose quite a bit of money. That includes things like fall damage or Rex's self-damage. 9 times out of 10 you'll just end up losing money at an inopportune moment. Now you might be thinking, well, what if you just waited until later in the run when everything starts dying super fast? Well, yes, you'd be making a lot of extra money then. But if you're at that point in a run, guess what you don't need more of? Money. It's really just not that helpful. But I'll admit, I've had a handful of runs where I'll get it early from a lunar pod and say, what the hell, and pick it up, and it did end up helping speed up the early game, so I'll give it a D for being good sometimes. Next, there's the infamous Corpse Bloom, which is going to get an E. Having the extra healing sounds nice, but once you get later on in a run, having your healing be limited to 10% of your max health per second is a huge downside. So if you're just planning on getting to stage 8 and obliterating and you don't have a lot of healing items, sure, it can actually be somewhat helpful. However, any runs that go past that are going to be severely hindered just by having it. Not to mention that if you pick up any more stacks, it halves your max healing per second for each stack. So if you have just 3 stacks, you're already down to 2.5% of your max health per second. On top of all that, there's a legendary item we'll cover later that does literally the exact same thing with no downside. But since it can be helpful, I'm giving it an E and not an F. Next, we have the recently added Focused Convergence, which is going to get a B. The only reason this item isn't higher is the reduction to the size of the teleporter is much more severe than you might think. The radius gets halved per stack. Remember when I said mobility is one of the best options of keeping you alive? Limiting yourself to such a small area is hardly worth the risk a lot of the time, especially against enemies like Wandering Vagrants, Worms, Malachites, Void Reavers, or even Scavengers. Now, yes, you can just leave the radius when you need to, but overall, the time you'll be spending dodging outside of the radius will probably just end up totaling up to the same amount of time you'd have spent without it anyways. However, once you get later in a run and enemies start dying faster than you can react, it's very nice not to have to just sit around for so long waiting for it to charge. I highly recommend avoiding getting more than 1 stack until the 3rd or possibly even 4th loop depending on your items. Next, there's the Gesture of the Drowned, which is an absolute S tier. As I discussed previously with fuel cells, your equipment in this game is a very powerful asset. This thing halves your cooldown on the first stack, which is huge. After that first stack, it actually scales the same way the fuel cells do, so you can use them interchangeably. I wouldn't recommend it though due to the lunar coin cost, unless you just cannot find any fuel cells anywhere. Regardless, your equipment activating automatically is a slight inconvenience at worst and just as powerful at best. With things like the capacitor, it just deletes a random enemy that you happen to look at every 10 seconds. Or with things like the Prion or missile launcher, it's free random damage twice as often. Or even with things like the Wood Sprite, the Jade Elephant, or even the Foreign Fruit, it's a massive increase to your survivability. Straight from one S tier item to another, we have the Shaped Glass. Now I know having your max HP sounds like a pretty big drawback, but let me explain. Remember how I explained one-shot protection earlier and how that works? That 50% of your max HP becomes your effective max HP. Now keep in mind most methods of healing in this game, like the Harvester Scythe and Leeching Seed for example, provide flat values of healing and aren't percentage based. So when you think about it, having a lower max health makes it easier to get back up to your one-shot protection. Less HP isn't looking like quite as much of a downside anymore, is it? Now consider that the glass stacks exponentially. So let's say you have 1000 max health. If you pick up just 3 stacks of glass, your max health now drops to an eighth of that, which is 125, which is very easy to get back up to if you get hit. Now keep that all in mind, I haven't even mentioned the damage yet. With those 3 stacks of glass, not only is it easier for you to abuse one-shot protection, literally everything you do now deals 8 times the damage. Shaped glass is extremely busted and would probably be the best item in the game if not for another item which we'll cover later. Next we have the Strides of Heresy, which are going to get a B. Rather than increasing one stat and lowering another, the Strides instead completely replaces your Survivor's utility skill, which is Shift by default on PC, with the new ability called Shadow Fade. Shadow Fade makes your character intangible for 3 seconds, and you heal for 25% of your max health over the duration. Any additional stacks of the Strides increases the duration and the total healing you get, but not the healing per second. Also, you can fly during Shadow Fade, which is fun, but keep in mind you'll start falling as soon as the effect ends. Shadow Fade's a pretty solid ability, so why are the Strides in B? Keep in mind they completely replace your Survivor's utility skill. Now, with some abilities like the Commando or Rex's default utilities, this can actually be really beneficial. In some cases it's personal preference like on the Artificer or the Engineer or Acrid. However, on characters like the Huntress, who has 2 extremely good utilities, or characters like the Loader and the Mercenary, whose vast majority of playstyle revolves around their utilities, you should never take the Strides. It's good, but due to how situational it is, it gets a B. Next we have the Transcendence, which is going to get a C. Basically take all the reasons I've previously explained why stacking shields are generally worse than just stacking your health, and take that to the extreme. Transcendence can be good if you're just going for as much health as possible and you're confident you can recover your shields enough. However, stacking health with items like Infusion or even the Titanic Neural will generally work out better for you. Finally we have the Visions of Heresy, which will also be in the C tier. Similarly to the Strides, the Visions completely replaces your primary attack with the new ability called the Hungering Gaze. I'll link another video that goes into more detail on the Visions because it's fairly complicated, but just know it's only really good in a handful of situations. I would recommend only really taking it on Acrid and maybe the Artificer and Loader, and maybe the Engineer if you really don't like his primary, but keep in mind your turrets will also inherit the Visions as well, and they aren't very good at aiming it. Now finally we get to talk about the equipments. Instead of being passive benefits to your character, these effectively take up a 5th ability slot, and each of them have their own unique effects and cooldowns. Many of them are very powerful. Many of them, unfortunately, are not. First up we have one of the not so good ones, the Blast Shower, which is going to be in the C tier. Now, the effect is nice. However, you aren't going to be coming across debuffs that often until later in a run, and there are better equipments we'll cover shortly that do a better job of keeping you alive in more situations. Overall, still not bad though, and a cooldown of 20 seconds is one of the shortest ones in the game, so if you're looking for something to synergize with the Warhorn, this isn't a bad candidate. Next, there's the Disposable Missile Launcher, which is going to get an A. The massive spread of damage the missiles do is very nice, whether you're up against a boss or a crowd of enemies. That combined with a decent cooldown of 45 seconds makes for a very solid equipment. The biggest drawback is that you can't really control what the missiles target. You can try to influence them, but unfortunately it's pretty random ultimately. Next we have the Eccentric Vase, which is going straight in the D tier. It can be helpful for quickly traversing the map or reaching previously out of the reach terrain with certain characters. However, you're going to put much more value in an equipment on either damage or survivability, not so much the utility. especially when you factor in there are better movement-based equipments, as well as most characters can reach most important places on a map, and it's just not very good. Next up we have the Foreign Fruit, which is going to get a B. The 50% max HP burst is very nice to have on deck, and with a decent cooldown. It can save you in some sketch situations for sure. However, like the Blast Shower, it just gets outclassed by other equipments. It's still a solid item though, especially early on before you get some reliable healing items. Finally, we get to talk about the literal only item going in the F tier, the Fuel Array. Honestly, this shouldn't really count as an item, but I'm ranking everything else, so I'm doing it anyways. Once you unlock Rex, this item is literally pointless. If you don't know, once you get below 50% of your max health, the Fuel Array gets destroyed and explodes, and it kills you instantly. There are no benefits to picking it up whatsoever. While trying to unlock Rex, I recommend looking for another equipment to hold during each stage and then going back to grab it before you enter the teleporter, because you don't need to have it on you at all times, just long enough to get it from stage to stage. This item does not benefit you whatsoever. It literally only makes your life harder. Never pick it up. Next, we get to talk about an actual good item, the Gnarled Wood Sprite, which is going to be in the A tier. Having a 10% max health heal on the shortest cooldown in the game of 15 seconds is very nice. On top of that, this thing also has a passive heal of 1.5% of your max health per second. So when compared to the Foreign Fruit, you only get 30% of your health upon activating it in the same amount of time you could activate the fruit. However, the passive heal through that entire 45 seconds comes out to 67.5% of your health, or 97.5% total. Remember when I said the fruit was just outclassed? On top of all that, if you're playing in multiplayer and feeling benevolent, you can activate it on an ally and give them the 10% heal instead, and then they'll receive the passive healing for 15 seconds before it comes back to you. It's a very helpful equipment. Next up there's the Jade Elephant, which is also going to get an A. I think the Jade Elephant's fairly underrated. 500 armor is nothing to sneeze at. Basically, 500 armor translates to an 83% damage reduction. Granted, it's only for 5 seconds, so it's hard to always use optimally, which is why it's an A. But the effect is super impactful, mainly against dangerous elite enemies, and most importantly, scavengers. If you've encountered one, you already know, but scavengers are the scariest enemies in the game. If anything is going to end your god run, it's a scavenger. With the elephant, you can afford to take more risks against scavengers, which is very important. The longer you leave a scavenger unattended, the more powerful they'll get. It's a very useful item, especially when you don't have the damage to just face roll everything. Next, we have the Milky Chrysalis, which is going to get a C. As much as I like the Chrysalis, it's not as helpful as you'd hope. It's very restrictive while you're flying around, so it's not as good in combat as you'd expect. It's better for traversing the map than the Vase, but like the Vase, you want to value damage or survivability more in an equipment. It's a fun item, but unfortunately it's not that useful. Next up we have the Ocular HUD, which is going to get an A. Now if you have 100% crit chance, this item's useless, don't pick it up. However, in the early to sometimes mid-game, it can be very helpful for your damage before you get a few lenses. As I mentioned with lenses, critting is one of the best ways to just increase your raw damage. Since there's only one item in the game that boosts your crit chance, excluding the 5% from the Scythe and Predatory, the HUD can be an easy way of giving you that crit chance until you start to get a few lenses. Basically, damage is good, critting is damage, critting is good. Next we have the fan favorite Prion Accumulator, which is also going to be an A tier. Now, I know a lot of people might disagree with me, but let me explain. The Prion does damage. It does a lot of damage. However, it has a very long windup, a very slow travel speed, and therefore is very easy to whiff. On top of that, if you do whiff it, it has a whopping 140 second cooldown. So in the reasonably likely case you do miss it, you're out of luck for another almost 2.5 minutes. Keep in mind the teleporter only takes 90 seconds to charge. It's one of those high risk and high reward items. I know it sounds like I'm ragging on it quite a bit, but it's still basically the easiest way to wipe your screen in the early to mid game. It's not quite an S because of what I mentioned, and there's another damage equipment that outclasses it that we'll cover here soon. Next up, there's the Primordial Cube, which is also going to get an A. The cube is very helpful for dealing with crowds. It's one of the best ways to help deal with crowds early on without having a ton of items actually. However, that's basically all it does. Sure, you can combine it with some wisps and get a massive chain explosion going, but without it, all the damage you get out of the cube still just comes from you. It doesn't directly benefit you or any of your items other than briefly dragging away some enemies. Like I said before, with an equipment, generally you'll want to prioritize damage or survivability over utility. Against bosses in particular, the cube won't help you out as much as you'd like. There are definitely better options. However, it's still a very solid item. Next we have the radar scanner, which is going in the D tier. Really, once you've played the game enough, you get a feel for the spawn of items and such. It might be helpful your first few runs, sure, but realistically it just doesn't do anything for you. Taking this over basically any other equipment isn't going to help you. Next up there's the recycler, which is going to get a B. Now it doesn't really help you directly, however it can still be very helpful. Did you get a red whip from the teleporter? Reroll it, see what you get. You might get an ATG or a guillotine. Did you get a bad legendary from a legendary chest? Reroll it, you might as well. Now, it ultimately just comes down to RNG, so it's not going to get any higher than a B. If you have it though, it's a really convenient item to have. Next, the moment I've all been waiting for, the Royal Capacitor, which is going to get a fat S. This thing is the big daddy of damage equipments. Nothing comes close to it. For reference, the Prion does 4000% damage on impact. The Capacitor, on the other hand, is an instant cast on an enemy. You literally cannot miss it unless they're moving very, very fast. It deals 3000% damage, can proc your items off of that hit, which can lead to some really nasty proc chains. And, on top of that, it has a 20-second cooldown. The Capacitor is absolutely nuts, and is one of the 2 contenders for best equipment by a long shot. Next we have the Somarang, which is going to get a B. The Somarang does some nice damage for sure, but the biggest drawback it faces is it has a very limited range, and the 45-second cooldown is a little too long for how much damage the saws actually do. And then the bleed, like most DOTs, just doesn't scale very well. It's still not a bad option, and it's definitely a cool one. Next we have the opposite of a cool thing, the backup, which is going in the D tier. Basically take the drones and the turrets you'll find around the map that you can buy. You know how not helpful those are? Now turn them into an equipment that lasts 25 seconds and has a 100-second cooldown. Combine that with lackluster damage and not good AI, and yeah, not a very good choice. Still not the worst one though. Next there's the Crowdfunder. Oh hey look, it's the worst equipment. Which is going to sit alone in the E tier. An equipment that costs money to fire? Okay, sure, I could use that during a teleporter fight, or later in a run, I guess. How much damage does it do? Oh, next to nothing? Oh, okay, it's not worth using. Noted. Yeah, this thing sucks, especially early on when you won't have a large stockpile of money. It is absolutely not worth using over literally any other damage equipment. Finally, we have the Volcanic Egg, which is going to get a C. This item is fun, and the explosion does some decent damage early on, but think about it this way. You've got to get real close to get any meaningful damage out of the explosion, and when you trigger the explosion, now you're caught right in the middle of all those enemies without a way to fly out of there quickly. It's very risky for the amount of damage it actually does. However, it's really good for traversing the map, and you can use it to get out of unfavorable situations somewhat reliably, so it's still solid enough. Now we'll be looking at the Lunar equipments, and this will be short. There's only 4 of them, and most of them aren't very good. These, like the other Lunar items, all come with some sort of catch. Most of them have pretty lackluster effects with very major downsides. One, however, is busted. First we have the Effigy of Grief, which is going all the way down to E. Now, having a 20 armor reduction on all enemies that walk into it sounds pretty good, right? After all, that comes out to about 17% more damage. However, the radius is fairly small, and they have to be directly in the radius to get the effect. And when you activate the effigy, it drops right where you're standing. Why is that a problem? Well, the slow and the armor reduction apply to all characters in its radius. That applies to you and any allies you have. Using it effectively cripples you until you can get out of the radius, and there's a decent chance you might just die while you're crippled. Overall, it's just not worth the risk. Next, we have the glowing meteorite, which is also going to get an E. Now, if we're talking fun factor, get a gesture and a couple fuel cells, and this thing is an S tier for sure. However, the random damage it spreads across the entire map, like the effigy, can apply to you and any allies, for 20 seconds. And the damage is random, like I said, so there's a good chance it won't even hit any of the immediate enemies around you. There's a very good chance this thing will just kill you, especially if you're either a low mobility character and or you just don't have many mobility items yet. Next up, there's the Hellfire Tincture, which is going slightly above the other two in the D tier. Why? This thing does a lot of damage to enemies if you're close enough with it, so on a character like the Mercenary, and basically just the Mercenary, it can actually be rather powerful. So why is it so low then? It deals 5% of your max health as damage to you per second for 10 seconds. You need a pretty good amount of healing items to keep your health up reliably during the Hellfire's duration. And if you have enough healing to sustain it, you probably have access to a better equipment by that point. And finally, we have the uber powerful Spinel Tonic, which is going to get an S. So what all does this thing do exactly? When you activate it, for 20 seconds, you get a 100% damage increase, a 70% attack speed increase, a 20 armor increase, which translates to about a 17% damage reduction, a 50% max health increase, a 300% health regen increase, and a 30% movement speed increase. So what's the catch? When it wears off, you have a 20% chance of getting a permanent debuff that decreases all of those stats by 5%, and it stacks. With one gesture and some combination of 3 fuel cells or other gestures, you can actually have full uptime on the tonic, which is what you want, because the debuff doesn't apply while the tonic is active. Without full uptime though, it can be very risky to use, especially once those afflictions start to stack up. If you can get full uptime though, the tonic is incredibly powerful. The tonic is the only equipment realistically giving the capacitor a run for its money. Next, I'm going to briefly cover the elite equipment because I said I'd cover everything. I'm just going to cover them all at once because they're all roughly equally useful. If you don't know what the elite equipments are, every elite you kill has a 1 in 4,000 chance of dropping their aspect, which correlates to what kind of elite they were. So if you pick it up, it takes up your equipment slot and you effectively become that kind of elite. So if you kill a blazing elite and it drops its aspect, you become a blazing elite. Now, these don't have any active effects like every other equipment, rather they're just a constant passive buff. But they still take up your equipment slot. Overall, they get a C. Their effects just aren't as useful as you'd hope, and they don't scale very well once you get further into a run. The best one for damage is probably the overloading one, or silence between 2 strikes as it's called. But even that doesn't scale very well. That one in particular also turns half of your max health into shields, like overloading elites. And as we've discussed, that can often be a detriment more than a benefit. Overall, these things just aren't nearly as powerful as you'd expect given how rare they are. It's always cool to see one drop though. Personally, I've gotten all of them to drop except for the Celestine aspect. Now the time has finally come to cover the legendary items. These are the big red items you'll rarely come across, but for good reason. Many of these are very powerful, so as you might expect, there are going to be quite a few S tiers and A tiers coming up. If you were worried that was all this section was going to be though, don't worry. There are still a few duds. First up we have the Aegis, which is going to get an A. Basically, if you're at max health, any healing you receive will instead be converted to barrier, like the Topaz Brooch. If you have a lot of reliable healing, you'll have basically full barrier all the time. If you don't have a lot of reliable healing though, this thing basically does nothing. So even though it can be very powerful, it's not quite an S. Next we have the Alien Head, which is also going in the A tier. Having the extra cooldowns is nice, absolutely. However, like I said before, a majority of your power later down the line is going to come more and more from your items, and you won't be needing your cooldowns as much. The only cooldown you'll really need more of is your utility skill, which there's another item specifically for that we'll get to later. Spoiler alert, however, the cooldown reduction is still a really nice plus, especially on Artificer. Next, there's the brain stocks, which also get an A. I swear I'm not doing this on purpose. So this item would be an S tier, but the reliance on killing an elite makes this pretty situational, at least until the late game, and the item description is a little misleading. See, there's no such thing as truly having no cooldowns in this game. Instead, all your cooldowns are set to 1 second. Which obviously is still really good, but not quite as good as the description makes it out to be. Plus, like I said, you won't really have reliable uptime on it until you get into the late game, and then you won't need your cooldowns as much then. Next, we have the Big Bad Brilliant Behemoth, which gets an S. Why does giving all of your attacks a small AoE warrant an S? Well, it doesn't. The AoE damage is applied separately from the normal hit, and that 60% is added on to the base hit. So basically, this thing is just a 60% increase to your damage. I don't think I need to tell you that that's a lot. The AoE is nice, but that's definitely not why the Behemoth is so strong. Speaking of which, word of the wise, don't go out of your way to get more than one of these. Obviously, it's not the end of the world if you get more, but stacking the Behemoth more just increases the radius of the AoE, not the actual damage. This is one of those items that's more of a one and done. Next up, there's the Ceremonial Dagger, which also gets an S. Have you ever wanted to kill something and then trigger a domino effect of kills? Man, I've got an item for you. Whenever you kill an enemy, 3 daggers spawn that will actively seek out and home in on enemies no matter where they are as long as they're in the radius. And if those daggers kill something, that thing will also spawn daggers. So if you get 1 kill, and those 3 daggers each get a kill, now you have 9 daggers. Later in your run, once you just get the first kill, these things will basically take care of everything for you. The daggers are insane. Also, the daggers each have a 1.0 proc coefficient. What, you didn't think they were crazy enough? Next, we have a couple not so good legendaries, the first of which is the Dio's best friend, which is going in the B tier. So wait, it's just a free second life, why is it in B? Well, it sounds really good, but look at it this way. When you have this item, it does literally nothing for you until you mess up and die, and then it goes straight back to doing nothing for you. It doesn't really help you deal with the potentially super dangerous monster that killed you, it's just a safety net for when you mess up. Which, don't get me wrong, it's really nice to have, but it's really not as helpful as you might think at first. Next up, there's the Frost Relic, which is going to get a slightly lower C. Really, this thing just doesn't do as much damage as it should for how close you have to be to really get much benefit out of it. It's nice extra damage for sure, but you have to put yourself in potentially unfavorable positions to get anything out of it. Plus, have you seen the explosive pots on abandoned aqueducts? If this thing is active and you run by one, it'll trigger the explosion. So if you're late in a run and not careful, you can say goodbye to that run. Granted, that's a very specific scenario, I know, but it's definitely something you should watch out for. Overall, not terrible, but not very good either. Next, we have the Head Stomper, which gets an even slightly lower D tier. The stomp this thing gives you just doesn't do enough damage, but the main effect of this thing is the jump height increase. Which sounds nice, but not until you account for the way acceleration works in this game. Basically, when you jump, you're immediately at the max velocity you'll reach during that jump. It only decreases from there. So once you get all the way up, you start to feel like a sitting duck when you fall straight back down. It's not terrible, especially with a few movement items, but man, when I'm using this thing, it just feels like a detriment more than anything else. Especially if you have a wax quail or two, your speed in the air starts to feel really sluggish. The best thing about this item though is the fall damage immunity, hands down. Next, we have the Happiest Mask, which will also be in the D tier. Now, the ghosts sound nice, but remember all the items we talked about that revolve around AI? Yeah, the ghosts aren't very smart either. The best they'll really do for you is draw some aggro. Other than that, they're not very useful. Unless you get a Clay Dunestrider ghost, which can and will suck you in once he gets low enough HP, and yes, it does damage you, so be careful. Next, we're taking a short break from the bad items to look at the Hardlight Afterburner, which gets an S. Your utility skill on most survivors is going to be one of your best options for traversing and dodging, even into the late game. Having 2 extra charges of that utility is very helpful in any situation. On top of that, you get a 33% cooldown reduction on that skill as well. It's an extremely helpful item, especially on characters like Mercenary and the Loader, whose playstyle revolves around their utility. Next, we're back to the last bad item, the recently added Interstellar Desk Plant, which is going all the way back down to the D tier. So, getting some extra healing for killing an enemy sounds nice, right? Well, it's active for 5 seconds, it's only 5% of your max HP per second, and the radius is same as the Bustling Fungus. Yes, the white item. On top of that, stacking this item does not increase the healing, it does only the radius, and it scales at the same rate that the fungus does. Did I mention this was a legendary item? If you want heal on kill, you'd honestly have better luck stacking a few fresh meat than going for this thing. It's a shame, it's an interesting idea, but it's not very helpful. Next, we're finally back to the good items, the Nukahana's Opinion, which gets an A. And I said that right, I promise. Now, the radius to fire the skulls is smaller than you'd like, and you need some healing items for it to really do anything. But once you get some, you'll start firing these things out constantly for just free extra damage. Also, the skulls can proc your other items, just saying. On characters that usually keep their distance like the Huntress, you won't get too much use out of it, but with characters like the Mercenary or the Commando, who are generally right in the action, or God forbid the Engineer with some Bustling Fungus going, this thing can dish out a lot of good damage. Next, we're back up to the S tier with the Rejuvenation Rack. Remember how the Corpse Bloom increases your healing by 100%, but that effect is so good that it has to limit your max healing per second? Yeah, the Rejuve Rack does that exact same thing, but with literally no downside. I don't think I need to explain why increasing your healing by such a drastic amount is so useful. Just one stack of this makes literally every healing item in the game twice as good. Next, we have the Resonance Disc, which is also going to be an S. This thing will select a target, launch itself at said target, piercing any enemy in its path for quite a bit of damage, hit the target, explode, then return to you, also piercing any enemies caught in its path. It can also proc your items on any enemy it hits on its way to and from a target, by the way. This thing is an absolute monster against boss enemies or just high health enemies in general. Grab just one of these and you'll begin to feel the power right away. Next up, there's the Sentient Meat Hook, which is not only the weirdest sounding name for an item, but also another S tier item. Remember how good I said the cube and the ukulele were? Imagine if you could do both by just attacking an enemy and not being on a 60-second cooldown. It immediately pulls the enemies in on the one you hit, and you don't have to wait for it to travel to the enemy, and it can deal damage, and any enemies hit by it can proc your other items. Yeah, this thing is incredible for crowds and proc chains. Honestly, once you get one of these, there's no real reason to have a cube anymore. Not to mention every stack not only increases the number of enemies you can pull in, but also increases the chance you have to proc it. Next, we have the Shattering Justice, which for its name and the sound it makes alone gets an S. Not really, but man, this thing makes the most satisfying noises I've ever heard. Regardless, just 5 hits with any attack will reduce an enemy's armor by 60, which comes out to an almost 40% damage increase. Not to mention the 5 hits that stack up and the armor reduction itself both count as a debuff, so this thing has incredible synergy with the Deathmark. Next is the Soulbound Catalyst, which also sits in the S tier. Have you ever wanted to reduce your equipment's cooldown but you just can't seem to find a gesture or a fuel cell anywhere? Well, just get one of these, or just do even if you do already have either of those, and any enemy you kill will reduce that cooldown. I don't think I need to explain why this effect is so powerful. Remember, equipment in this game are generally very powerful. Killing enemies is something you're already doing. You get your equipment more often for killing enemies. Win-win. Next up, we have the Unstable Tesla Coil, which is also going to get an S. I said there were going to be a lot of these, didn't I? Every 10 seconds, this thing will zap random enemies around you for a decent amount of damage. It's good for those pesky wisps that won't leave you alone while you're dealing with a vagrant or something, but why is it so high? Say it with me, kids. Each hit the Tesla Coil does can proc your other items. It's just free extra proc coefficient and a radius around you that also deals some decent damage on its own. Why wouldn't you want one? And next, breaking the pattern, we have the Wake of Vultures, which unfortunately gets at B. I want this item to be good because I think the effect is very cool. However, take all the reasons I explained why the elite equipments weren't very good, and that all applies here. The elite aspects just aren't nearly as strong on you as they are on enemies. Plus, like I said, the overloading aspect specifically can ruin your one-shot protection. Overall, still a decent enough item, but not powerful enough to get any higher than a B. And now, for the moment you all knew was coming, we have the one and only 57 Leaf Clover, which is going to sit above the rest as the sole member of the arbitrary SS tier. This thing is hands down the best item in the game. Why? It makes literally every other item that has a percentage chance to happen, excluding the teddy bears, better. Basically, let's say you have an ATG, and you hit something with a 1.0 proc coefficient, so the ATG has a 10% chance to trigger. If you have a Clover, if that roll doesn't trigger the ATG, the Clover will make that roll again to potentially trigger it anyways, and it will re-roll for every Clover you have, and it will never re-roll a positive outcome. So if you have an ATG and it rolls to proc on that first roll, the Clover will just leave it alone. It only benefits you. But it relies on other items, so why is it so highly rated then? Well, just for reference, the Clover affects each and every one of the following. Your crit chance, the tonic's chance to give you an affliction, the stun grenade, the tri-tip dagger, the brittle crown, the ukulele, the sentient meat hook, the sticky bomb, Renault's band, Kiara's band, the ATG missile launcher, the bandolier, the happiest mask, the old war stealth kit, and Gore's tome. Go back and look at all those things and think about how powerful most of those effects are. Now consider that the Clover makes literally all of those that much more likely to happen per stack, and you can see why the Clover will almost certainly always be the best item in the game. So there you have it, an exhaustive ranking and explanation of every single item in Risk of Rain 2. I'll put up a visualization on the screen for quick reference, or anyone who just wants a TLDW general idea of how everything stacks up. I hope this list helps any new players get a better feel for the game. Obviously, I don't know everything, but this list was put together after a lot of gameplay, a lot of thought, and a lot of input from friends as well. If you have any opinions on the list, please let me know what you think. Do you think I'm overly harsh on some items? Do you think I overhype some items? Feel free to discuss. If you'd like to see more videos like this one, please let me know. This video took a long time to make, but I really enjoyed putting it together, and I would not mind making more videos like this. So for now, everyone that's watching, please stay safe and be smart, especially with everything that's going on right now. I will see you all in another video. Next we have the Brittle Crown, which is going to get a D. Now the extra money can be nice, however literally any damage you take will cause you to— oh my— Jesus! I did not feel that coming whatsoever. Next we have the Brittle Crown. Oh god.